Good afternoon. You know, it's fascinating because normally when somebody stands up and reads your CV, it's meant to flatter you and make you feel relevant. But I'm sure all of you would admit that given what we're discussing tonight, I'm totally ill-equipped to have this conversation because it's not my area of expertise. So you won't be surprised that as a non-historian, I'm going to approach this topic from a common sense, ordinary person perspective. And my only justification for doing that is that the ordinary person is not sitting in this room. And if we are going to be relevant to the people that we claim to lead, then we have to find a way of making what we debate relevant to them. It's got to relate to their lived reality. But before I talk to my few notes here, let me go back to the conversation we just had about colonization. I was fascinated by some of the questions which verged on being philosophical, and I decided to ask a friend of mine. We had a very unfortunate experience to allow me to use her experience to illustrate how complicated this issue of what are facts and what do facts justify. So I've got a very dear friend of mine who is female, and a few years ago she was raped. And out of that rape, she got a child. And she loves the child dearly. The question which arises from the question of colonization, was it good or bad, is can you ever justify that she's got a child who she loves? Can you use that to justify her having been raped? I think the answer is very clear to all of us. The answer is no. So there is no benefit that comes out of colonization that can be used, in my opinion, to justify that colonization happened. I think it just goes to show the complexity in many ways of what we're trying to debate. And when I was asked by Vasu to come and share my ideas or thoughts with you, I found myself jumping to the conclusion and saying there is no conversation to be had. Because what is history? What are facts? Language is fascinating because language tends to tell you through idioms what is fundamental to some of these debates. In one of my country languages, Shona, there is an expression which says, Demo ndiro risinga kangano. Demo ndiro rino kangano, amuti au kangano. And literally it means when you take an axe and go and cut a tree, the axe forgets, but the tree never forgets. And it's a powerful way. So you can describe that factually. What happened? A tree was cut. Can you ever construct a history of facts which is the same from both sides? The answer is no. Because it was not the same. It was not the same for the two, call them protagonists if you like. So anyway, let me go back to the beginning. What do conflicts tend to arise out of? A number of things, not totally exhaustive. But conflicts arise often from history itself. History can give rise to conflict because that history is with it a starting position where both parties consider themselves justified to act in the way they did. So the pre-historical events, or what leads to the conflict, positions the protagonists already in a prejudiced position. There would have been no conflict if one of them did not believe they were justified. Both of them say they are justified to do or to involve themselves in the conflict. They've justified it already. And then the next problem which arises is what they then do during the conflict. Often what they do during the conflict ties them into a perpetual justification of what they did during the conflict. So two issues arise. What they thought before, which led them to get involved in the conflict, and then what they do during the conflict, which then ties them or locks them into a perpetual justification of why that conflict, as far as they are concerned, was justified. That's one reason why conflicts happen, because of history. Then the colonization debate, conquest. Conquest has given rise to conflict in the past. I don't think I need to dwell on that anymore. In today's world, a lot of the time, conflicts arise out of a fight for resources. An unfairness, perceived unfairness in the distribution of resources, to a point where one party or other decides that there is no rational way of engaging the others in resolving that issue. So again, one party then justifies it resolving to a conflictual method of engagement to try and bring the other side to its senses. And lastly, but like I said, non-exhaustive, perceived injustice. Perceived injustice again often leads to conflict when the one party that feels ill-treated says, I cannot rationally engage the others to make them change their ways of behavior. And our countries in this part of the world, we're very familiar with this. So Zimbabwe, South Africa, apartheid, and Ian Smith, we know exactly, we've traveled that particular issue. So, as I said, just to repeat, embedded in the events that lead to conflict is already a self-justification as to who is right and wrong. And that starting position says, if you ask those two parties, you're going to be presented with two versions of history. Two versions of history. And, I think the gentleman who asked about objective facts, he seems to have gone. So I don't think that there is anything like objective facts. A lot of the people sitting in this room are students. Part of what you're trained to do is to weigh up both sides of the argument. Because often, both sides of the argument have got a certain validity in them. It's not like one side is valid and the other is absolutely not valid. And I think part of what makes us as human beings be able to live in a society is precisely the ability to listen to what you may not have thought of before, because it's coming from somebody else. Pay attention, respect it, and give it credibility, and then you can find a middle ground. If you don't do that, you start off by saying, I'm right and the other side is wrong. And from my experience, and I'm quite advanced in years, I won't tell you how old I am, but from my experience, I've discovered that when I figure something out and I think I've nailed it, and then I bring it to a group of people for conversation, for discussion, they will always come up with something that I had not considered. So it's humbled me to discover that actually when I get other people to consider whatever the issue is, somebody will come up with something that I had not considered. So I'm always open-minded when I deal with issues. I always expect and invite and welcome a different perspective. So different realities, different journeys travel, give you a different insight into what is real and what is not. Now, when you look at the issue of colonization, I think there are two different elements which we need to respect. The starting point that I've just articulated is that genuinely people perceive different realities. The actions during a conflict, however, also then give rise to the second complication that those who act in a conflict then seek to justify their actions forever after. And that again creates your aspiration about, can you ever find a way of using history to create situations where you achieve reconciliation? I think it's a tall order. I think it's a tall order because when you consider those input factors, I start off justifying myself. I then do things that lock me into continuing to justify it. What is the probability that an engagement afterwards can ever bring me to say, you know what, if I am the victim, If I'm the tree, not the axe, forgive and forget. It was okay. From what perspective can it ever have been okay? You use an axe and you cut me. How can it ever be? What argument are you going to use to make me see a positive element to the fact that you committed an atrocity against me, against those I consider dear to me? I think it's very, very difficult. And again, this conversation about colonization for me is interesting. Now in Southern Africa, we are dealing here in South Africa with the land issue. We're dealing in Zimbabwe again with the land issue. Kenya, some of you may not be aware, a lot of the tribal issues today in Kenya stem from a inherited land issue way back to the colonization period. So how do you argue your way into justifying a reconciliation about a wrong that was done in history? What does the solution look like? What does the solution of the land debate in South Africa look like? I don't think I'm actually smart enough to figure that one out. Because I think it's almost like, and I'm going to give an example just now, it's almost like we need, if you belong to a society, you have to justify how you're going to deal with history and conflict on the basis of what you want to achieve. Let me try to explain this. An example that is often quoted is Germany. Germany, excuse me using your countries. Germany is held as one of the few countries that has been able to confront its history much more brutally than anybody else. I think the question we have to ask, however, is what is the intention behind that ability to confront that history so brutally? Is it altruism or is it a much more selfish reason? Is it altruism, in other words, to do good, to learn from the history for the benefit of humanity as a whole? Or could it be it's for a purely selfish national reason? Let me maybe give you a possible explanation, and please feel free to deny this. When you look at how Germany runs its affairs today, you could argue that the value that Germany is derived from that brutal confrontation with history is not so much to humanity. The benefit is to Germany itself as a nation. It's configured its affairs internally in a manner where there is a lot of lessons learned from that history. And when you then align self-interest with that history, it's easier to confront the history because you are doing it in order to do good for yourself, self-interested confrontation of history. But if that confrontation leaves you in a very bad place with respect to other social groupings, I think it becomes very difficult to do. So my own personal takeaway from this is that for our continent, what I perceive often is that we continuously deprive ourselves of the benefit of learning from history for our own benefit, not for doing any global good. But when you don't confront your own history, you can't apply what I would call the dividends. There is an investment you make every time you live through events. And I think you owe it to yourself to derive maximum lessons learned from that in order to better the lives of those who are within your community. So forget the altruism issue, because I think it's very problematic. But I think there is an element which we're not considering, which is very valuable. Another example that has happened in recent years is the UK and the Commission of Inquiry on the Iraqi War. That appeared to me to be quite brutal in terms of how it was dealt with. But again, make no mistake, it was not for the benefit of you and I. I don't think so. It was solely for the benefit of the United Kingdom, learning from its own actions, call them mistakes if you like, to make sure that any future actions would be informed by what was good or bad about that action. So self-interested interpretation of history, the closer that interpretation is to, the more subjective it is, objective rather, to reality, the more value you're going to derive from it. But when I observe our African attitude to history, I think we are much more inclined to bend history more than anybody else. But I think we do ourselves a disservice. Forget about anybody else, we do ourselves a huge disservice because we do not provide a platform for future learnings in order to avoid, or in fact, benefit or learn from positives of that history and negatives of that history. So we need to look at it from a purely self-interested perspective. That is the value, to me, of history to a particular nation. And like I said, let me just give you a few idioms. I've told you about the Shona one, but there is another interesting one, which I think talks to challenges, if you like, the moral or ethical arguments about what we do or don't do. What does all is fair in love and war mean? What does it try to tell us about our actions and decisions? What does it seek to justify about what we may or may not do? All is fair in war and love. I think it's worth taking away and thinking about. Because in there, we appear as society to underplay the actions that we may take during. So whether it's a war or contestation for a potential lover, then we do whatever we do and say the end justifies the means. These idioms, I think, are very powerful just to tell us what is at the base of the things we do. I want to finish on, again, a couple of questions. I'm a natural scientist. I'm not a philosopher in the sense of, and I'm not a historian. But I try to go back to basics. It appears to me that the question we are failing to answer, and we will probably never be able to answer, is what is the natural state of being? What is the natural state of being? When I have a fluid and I put it on a surface, it will always, without exception, flow downhill. That's a natural law. The natural laws tell you if I've got a fluid and I put it on a surface, it will always flow downhill. And in that statement, by the way, I'm not saying you cannot build a dam. I'm not saying you cannot stop it. I'm telling you about a much more basic issue, the natural state of being. You can build a dam, you can pump it upwards, but its natural state of being is that on a surface, if the surface is uneven, a fluid will always, without exception, flow downhill. What is our natural state of being about the issues that we're debating? If you strip away our attempts to regulate, to manage, to tinker around with social arrangements, what is our natural state of being? I do not know the answer, but I think basically the question you are asking leads you into that space. The second issue, which I think is related to this, is I think as part of the animal kingdom, we are programmed with an instinct for survival. We are programmed with an instinct for survival. When we are pushed, and when it becomes a life and death issue, what do we do? What do we do without rationality, without any logic? What do we do instinctively? Again, I think that when you find an answer to those questions, you'll be closer to answering the first question that I posed. What is the natural state of being? Thank you very much.